Purple flowers. It was dark when the small alarm clock sounded. Will turned the clock off and sat up in the bed. He yawned and scratched his head. He was reminded he had cut his hair the day before. Most of it was gone. He scratched his chin, and where there had once been a beard, there was only a thin stubble. He stood and turned on the light in the attic. His clothes were folded on the floor. Everything else was packed. He dressed and put on his shoes. He picked up his bags and his notebook computer, and he descended the stairs slowly, like a pack animal on a narrow mountain passage. Only his peril was not a fall to his death. His peril was waking Mrs. Duncan. The truck was parked on the street. He stepped slowly down the front steps, down the wet footpath, across the sidewalk, across the street, and to the truck. He loaded the bags in the cab. He put the notebook computer on the passenger seat. The lights were not on in the Dolphin. Fred hadn't even arrived yet. A streetcar shuffled past up the road. Will got into the truck and turned the keys. He pumped the gas pedal and kept the key turned. He bent his head down and talked to the engine in his mind. Come on, come on, come on. The engine huffed and puffed and then turned over. He sat up. Robert Polsky was at the side of the truck, looking in at him. He rolled down the window. You leaving, Will? Yeah. You never told me. I'll be back. Those your bags, Will? Yeah. You never told me you were leaving. I'll be back, Robert. When? When I've found my vision in the world. Are you an economist, Will? No, Robert. In the legal definition, I'm not an economist. I've never received salary or commission under that title. Are you an economist, Will? It's a matter of interpretation, Robert. Are you going to be okay? I'm fine, Will. I've been fine for a long time. Just in case I don't come back, Robert, if anything happens to your benefits check because of undeclared income, just go see Mr. Willis at the Royal Bank. He'll take care of everything. Will put the transmission in drive and slowly pulled away in the beat-up Ford. There wasn't much traffic at all. He drove through Parkdale and up Ronsonsvale Street. He went up Black Creek Drive to Highway 400, and then he went north to Highway 11, and he kept going north. He watched the day begin over the rock and snow and evergreens that spotted the side of the highway. The evergreens had freed themselves of snow and ice. The north was leaving winter behind. The sky was blue with ribbons of cloud dancing in the wind. He stopped once for gas and a coffee. He bought 3 bottles of water for the truck. He went an hour past North Bay, then got off the highway. It was wild country. Narrow and ungraded dirt roads that bumped and creaked the old Ford. He slowed down to 50 kilometers an hour. He had to watch very closely. The signs would be small. He found the first road on Cobb's list. It had no name, just a number, and only a small green sign. It was the same for the next road. He drove until he crossed over the stone bridge. He made his first left. He drove for another 30 minutes and found the wood garage Cobb had put in his directions. It was just a wrought wood shack with a chain and a padlock over 2 wooden doors that pulled open. The road, in fact, ended with the garage. The truck was to go in the garage. That was the end of the plan. He didn't know when he would see Cobb again. He didn't have any place to go. There was no risk analysis, no projection into the future, no insight whatsoever into what came next. What came next was the product of a completely unstructured imagination. He locked his clothes and computer in the truck. He locked the truck in the garage. He put all the keys where he had found the garage key, under a painted stone at the corner of the garage. He picked up the bag with the books in it, and he walked into the bush with Cobb's directions. It was an act of God, but not the kind that wipes out insurance companies. The other kind, an act of faith. The signs weren't hard to see. The directions began with a footpath. The path went for 20 minutes at a normal walking pace. He would see a small pile of stones, no higher than his knee, but he had to be careful, the directions warned. It might be buried under brush. He was to go over the hill behind the stones, and on the other side he would find a stream. The stream flowed toward the lake. He was to follow the stream as the water flowed. It would lead him to their property. He followed the directions. He could get lost in the woods and never find his way out. He found the stream as the directions had said. He followed the flowing water for about an hour, stopping only once to rest beside a large tree. And as he sat there, he remembered what Polsky had told him. A tree is a word in somebody else's language. He closed his eyes and leaned against the trunk of the tree. His mind was left to play with all of the sounds around him. The birds, the wind pushing through the trees, and small creatures that moved through the forest. And, for the moments he rested under the tree, his eyes closed, the stream inside of him was the same as the stream outside of him. He got up and started walking again. In short time, he came to a plain and simple cabin. He walked around to the front. There was a beautiful lake in front of it. There were no other buildings around the lake. There were no docks out. He assumed he was in the right place, and so he went through the front door. There was no heat in the cabin. There was a pot-bellied stove that was cold to the touch, and a pile of wood in the corner. The cabin had big windows and was well lit. There was one large table with 8 chairs, and there were 4 bunk beds at the back. It was a hunt camp. The first thing Will did was build a fire, and then he took off his jacket, his shoes, and his socks. His feet were wet from walking through the woods. There was a note on the table. He got one of the pots from under the sink and went down to the lake and broke through the ice to get a pot full of water. He brought the water back and placed the pot on top of the pot-bellied stove. Then he went over to the cupboard and looked for tea. It was time to break his fast. There were a number of tin boxes in the cupboard. One had tea bags and one had sugar. There were mouse droppings all around. He took out the tins and a metal teacup. He went outside and washed the cup with snow. When the water boiled, he put the cup into the pot and brought it back out half full of water. He dropped a tea bag in and 2 pinches of sugar. He jiggled the cup to stir it. It tasted fine. He went back over to the cupboard to look for plates, of which there were none. There were only canned stews and canned beans and a can opener. He opened a can of beans and put it on the stove. The fire was roaring in the stove, and anything placed atop it heated up quickly. In a few minutes he was eating the beans with his fingers. They didn't taste bad. It was his first meal in over a week. The instructions in the note were clear. He would see the vision in the world when he was ready to see it. It would begin when he was not looking for it. He would see something from the vision, and then shortly after that, something else. When he was certain that the vision had started, he was to leave the cabin and make the journey to his vision. A vision is always a journey, Cobb wrote in his note. It has been this way since the beginning of time. He sat and stared at the fire, and time disappeared. They must have known this 10,000 years ago, he thought. The simple and elegant rhythms of firelight. There was never the same exact flicker of flame, never the exact same plume of smoke, and there was such a deep and peaceful presence in the fire, its crackling sound drowning out the noises from the forest. Heat and light, that's all it was, heat and light. As the day turned to night, it became colder. As the night settled in and darkness surrounded the cabin, he put on his socks, which had dried beside the stove, and he put on his shoes, and he went out into the night. He walked to the foot of the lake with the pot. He filled it with water and stood up. The sky was brighter than he had ever seen a sky. There were no lights except the firelight inside the cabin, and the stars filled the sky. He stood and stared at time's map until the cold demanded that he return to the cabin. He made one more cup of tea, then lay down on one of the bunks at the back of the cabin. He slept in short spells. The cold woke him up. The sounds from the forest woke him up. At one point in the night, he heard movement on top of the cabin. He didn't know what it was. It frightened him. He sat up in bed. His heart was beating quickly. He remembered what Cobb had told him, that fearful things were in the world because there was fear in people. It comforted him, and he fell back asleep. He woke later in the night. The light woke him up. The moon was full, and so bright it was like a spotlight shining into the cabin. He stared at it the same way he had stared at the firelight, in awe and wonder. While he was up, unsure what time it was, or when the morning would come, He put another log onto the coals in the stove, and then he crawled back into bed. From bed, he looked at the moonlight on the floor. The hatchings in the window made a cross shadow on the floor, and the way the light stretched it, there was an uncanny resemblance to a crucifix. He became very aware, very suddenly, and his back tingled. The moon was a bright light. The shadow was the crucifix. And the note on the table was from Cobb, who had spoken to the crow. A bright light, a crucifix, a crow. The vision had started. Yes, he believed it. The vision had started. He sat up in bed and stared at the light on the floor. He resolved to set off at first light. He slept no more that night. He made tea and beans for breakfast when he saw the dimming of the darkness and the stars. He ate and then laced up his shoes and opened up the door. The sun was just coming up at the back of the cabin. He walked down to the lake and touched a large stone. And he said to himself, a stone, a crucifix, a bright light, and a crow. He sat crouched for a moment, and the morning stillness was cracked by the wretched sound of a crow. Will looked up, and he saw a crow perched high above him on the branch of a winter bare birch tree. It was a powerful omen. He felt alive in a simple and elemental way, completely alive, the way he had felt when he had woken in his dormitory 12 months past. He started walking the snow trail beside the stream, and he followed it to the dirt road, and then, like an idiot, he turned around again and walked back to the stream. He bent down and touched his fingers to the water, and he said to himself, a stream, a stone, a crucifix, a bright light, and a crow. He walked back out onto the dirt road and started to walk. It was the opposite of sleepwalking. His feet kept stepping one ahead of the other, but he had no consciousness of walking. The whole morning passed in this state. Then his mind began to play tricks with him. What would constitute a bear for the sake of the vision? If he made it back to a diner in town and read in the newspaper about the spring bear hunt, would that be a part of the vision in the world? And what of the cross? The hatching in the window by moonlight was only the concept of the crucifix. He stopped dead in his tracks. He opened the book bag he had with him and shuffled through it quickly. He pulled out the crucifix he had stolen from Mrs. Duncan's rooming house. He stood holding it in his hand. The vision was coming into the world. The Indian had told him the truth. His mind was electric. Everything was so clear, so perfectly clear. It was all starting to make sense. He walked on into the afternoon alone, in the middle of northern Ontario, with a cool spring wind pushing through the woods and giving the trees the breath they needed to speak their word. The dirt road cut through the rock terrain in peaks and valleys and turns. He took breaks and sat at the side of the road. He hadn't seen another person since the coffee he had bought the day before. As he walked the long dirt road, he came to some sense of what arduous and back-breaking work clearing the northern woods and leveling the terrain must have been. They must have worked from sun-up to sundown, ate their meals in the bush, and even slept in the bush, at least in the spring and fall. Or maybe all year, he thought, in bush camps. Before the roads, there were rivers. The country had first been explored by canoe, and canoes were the first commercial vehicles. Unlicensed, uninsured, but commercial nonetheless. Built for the purpose of transporting people and goods. Where the rivers ended, they walked. They picked up their canoes and tied their goods to their backs, and they walked through the woods until they found the next river, which was always where they left it. There were no signs except what sun, wind, and water said to the trees, the stones, and the earth. That was all they needed. Nothing had to be written down. The directions were all around them. They just had to be seen. Tens of thousands of years passed on the continent of North America. Human beings lived in the woods and traveled by canoe and horse. Whatever they owned, they could put on their backs when the seasons turned. The world he was walking through that day had been the only world for millennia. What the sun, the wind, and the water said to the trees, the stones, and the earth. He felt hungry and tired, but he was possessed of some spirit that put one foot after the other in a steady progression down the road. And whatever it was, it preferred to be left alone in some ecstatic vigilance, scanning the woods, the sky, and the earth beneath his feet. In the whole day he came across no clue of anyone in the wilderness with him. No vehicles, no voices, no distant smell of wood smoke. He was utterly alone. He thought about the year he had lived in Parkdale. He remembered that he had stopped the flow of his life to follow the vision, and the whole thing just seemed hilarious to him then, as though he were living in a dream, and none of it made sense, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. He realized there was knowledge to be had just in the pursuit of a dream, as he knew that poverty was the inability to see your dreams in the world, and he thought about 1109897 Ontario Inc. He thought about its core belief that people would one day pay to breathe. He felt bad, but he remembered that his dream journey had been beautiful. He had seen so many wonderful things and so many wonderful people. It was almost better to live your life in a dream, he thought, and maybe that of itself was the purpose of the vision. To make him human and weak and vulnerable, to show him the world from the bottom up, from the tangled roots to the twisted branches, and from his naked imagination outward. And he was just very grateful for the whole thing, the insane seasons he had lived in Parkdale. And he was worth a lot of money, and his wealth was growing daily, building out from itself like an organism. And he was less than a year out of school, and he thought, how could any science that uses equations with human behavior as a variable even be a science? It was all just a sham. Economics was a sham. It was like some unknown place out there in the bush, a place where only a single imagination was dreaming. There was no need for law. Conflict can't arise when there's only one dream. The day began to slip away. The sun inched down lower and lower. He didn't know how far he was from the main highway. He didn't know how much longer he would have to walk the dirt roads in the bush. He might be walking them all night by moonlight and starlight. He wasn't afraid. Fear could not take root in him anymore. He was prepared to walk through the woods at night. He was prepared to sleep by the side of the road if he became too tired. Before he was put to that test, though, he saw a large black bear. At first he thought the bear wasn't real. He thought that he somehow dreamed the bear. And so he just kept walking towards it. The bear darted into the bush and disappeared. He walked up to where the bear had gone into the woods, and he saw the broken sticks and the clear path into the brush. The bear was real. A bright light, a crucifix, a crow, a stone, a stream, and a bear. Further up the road, he thought, I walk towards a bear. I'm fearless. The vision has made me fearless. He heard a grunt behind him. He froze. He heard the grunt again. He turned around. The bear had come out of the woods a short way down the road. It stared at him. He stared at the bear. 4 cubs emerged. They must have been tucked in the bush the whole time. He stood still, half expecting one of the bears to have purple flowers in its mouth. The mother bear guided the cubs to the other side of the road. A truck drove up beside him. He hadn't even heard it. It was a beat-up old Ford. He walked up to the passenger side and poked his head into the open window. It was an Indian girl about the same age as him. Anai, the girl said. Ayani, he said back. It meant hello in the tongue of the Ojibwa people. Cobb had taught him the word. What are you doing out here, she asked. I'm pulled by the magic of dream, he told her. I'm on a journey. How long have you been on your journey, she asked. I came to this road just after the sun this morning, but I've been on the journey for 4 seasons. What are you looking for, she asked. Purple flowers, he said. What kind of purple flowers, she asked. What medicine are you making? I don't know what kind of purple flower, he said. What was in your eye when you dreamed, she asked. Could you not see the flowers? Any purple flower, he said. She put the truck in park and got out of the cab. She walked to him on the other side. She looked into his eyes. She was beautiful. She took him to the back of the truck and opened the cap. The bed of the truck was full of potted plants and flowers. She pointed to the back of the truck and said, I have violets and purple daffodils. He saw the purple leaf and started to cry. He said, a bright light, a crucifix, a crow, a stone, a stream, a black bear, and purple flowers. Are you finished your journey now? She asked. I am, he said. You are? I am. Where are you going now? Toronto. I can take you there, she said. I have to deliver these flowers. They got into the truck and drove away. The sun was going down. It was dark by the time they got to the highway. They drove in silence for a long time. The radio in the truck didn't work. They stopped for coffee and gas, and when they were back on the highway, he started to speak. He told her about his life as it had unfolded over the past year. Every detail, all the events, up to and including Patty's suicide, and then somewhere between the dirt road where she picked him up and Toronto, they pulled over at a rest stop and made love in the truck. It was his first time. He told her as they lay beside the potted flowers in the bed of the truck, tucked between two sleeping bags. She held him tightly. He looked out the small window of the truck. He could see the stars in the night sky. It was a vision by my interpretation, he said. Love is the most basic human exchange. It's good medicine, she said. End of chapter.